right, everyone, we'll get started. I'm sure people will trickle in, but good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Trustworthy Information in the 21st Century, Fantasy or Reality webinar, hosted in the framework of OGP's Europe Dialogues series. And it is a pleasure to see all of you joining this conversation. We have a great line of speakers waiting for you to share very interesting experiences and different initiatives. Before we begin, here is a little reminder to you that we are offering live AI-powered translation via the Wordly app. You can see the instructions on the screen right now. We will host the event in English, but if you require translation, please scan the QR code on the left side. Wanda has kindly also shared instructions in the chat, so you can select your preferred language for captions and audio during the webinar. Now, this information is no longer a side issue for specialists, and this is why we're here today. It really cuts to the core of how democracies function, how public institutions are trusted, and how we as citizens make decisions. Digital technologies and social media have certainly made it easier than ever for people to access information, to connect across borders, and to hold power to account. But at the same time, the very same tools have also created powerful channels for false, misleading, and manipulated content to spread at speed and scale. And in Europe, this challenge really is not abstract. We see disinformation shaping debates on elections, on migration, climate, security, to name a few. For open government reformers who are here today, the question really is not only how to react to harmful content, but also how to safeguard an information ecosystem that supports transparency, accountability, and public participation rather than undermines them. So to really create a very basic definition base for all of us, when we talk about disinformation during this webinar, we mean information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, a social group, an organization, or even a country. Misinformation, by contrast, is information that is false, but it's not created with the intention to cause harm. So people might share it because they believe it is true, or it is presented as such. And increasingly, what we see as well is that the conversation is about information integrity. We talk about the accuracy, consistency, and reliability of information and systems that produce and distribute it, so that lines of communication between governments and the public are trustworthy and resilient. You might have seen that OGP has put out an Open Gov Guide chapter on disinformation and information integrity. Wanda has kindly put the link in the chat here. This makes two important points relevant to today's discussion. So first, this information is already damaging public health, democracy, and national security, and in the worst cases, has been used to justify the adoption of overly broad laws that can damage privacy as well as civic space and media freedom. But second, open government approaches offer a constructive alternative. Instead of focusing only on taking content down, governments can also promote high-quality information through proactive transparency, public communication, media freedom, and strong safeguards for freedom of expression. From a European perspective, this matters for at least three reasons, not an exhaustive list. The European Union, as we will shortly hear, is investing in new tools and frameworks that put information integrity at the heart of democratic resilience. Second, many European countries are OGP members, which means that they have a concrete platform through their action plans and reforms to translate these principles into real change. And finally, Europe is both a target and the source of global norms. So how we address this information here will influence standards and practices far beyond this region, for better or for worse. So during today's webinar, we will hear about new European initiatives on information integrity. We'll hear about global perspectives on media freedom and platform governance, and concrete open government approaches that are already being used on the ground, from investigative journalism to behavioral insights and AI's role in spreading disinformation. As you listen, you might keep in mind a few questions. How can transparency, accountability, and participation help build a healthier information environment? How do we protect rights while tackling harm? And how can European and global initiatives reinforce each other rather than operate in silos? So with this framing in mind, let's now turn to our first speakers to dive into the European policy landscape and what it means in practice for member states, civil society, and citizens. We start off from the broadest perspective, that is, from the European Commission's initiative called the European Democracy Shield and its accompanying Centre for Democratic Resilience. To introduce these two, I now welcome two guest speakers. We have Nicolin Murel-Kivu, who is a legal and policy officer at DG Just, and Uldis Elksnitis, who is an information and communications officer at DG Com. I'll start with you, Gur. The European Democracy Shield is a very important initiative announced by the European Commission already in 2025, focusing on information integrity, strengthening institutions, and societal resilience. So today, can you share a little bit more of what the key issues that the Shield aims to address are? Through which specific instruments is it planning to do that? And perhaps also we can touch upon what the initiative means for member states, for civil society, as well as for accession countries in practice. Over to you, Mgur.
Thank you, Karina, and hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak on a question that goes to the very heart of the democracies, which is the question of trustworthy information in the 21st century, fantasy or reality. Now, if we look at the world around us, as you have already stated, it is easy to understand why this question has become so urgent. We live in an era of unprecedented connectivity. Information travels instantly across borders. It reaches millions within seconds and shapes political debate in real time. Digital technologies and artificial intelligence have transformed the way we communicate, we participate in our democracies, and we access information and knowledge. And this transformation has brought enormous democratic opportunities. I would like to start with the positive side of this. Citizens have more ways to engage in public life, to express opinions and hold power to account. But at the same time, the information environment has become increasingly contested, polarized, fragmented, vulnerable to manipulation, disinformation, as you said. And today, authoritarian actors, foreign powers, malicious networks exploit basically the openness of our democratic societies through foreign information manipulation and interference, what we call shortly FIMI, and disinformation. And they seek to distort the public debate, to undermine trust in institutions and weaken democratic resilience, basically from within the European Union. And disinformation basically is no longer only about spreading falsehoods. It is about eroding trust, trust in facts, trust in institutions, trust in elections, and ultimately trust in democracy. And this challenge is growing. And the use of bots, fake accounts, coordinated influence campaigns, and artificial amplification has become more and more sophisticated. And artificial intelligence now enables the creation of highly convincing synthetic content at an unprecedented scale and speed. And manipulation techniques basically have proven to evolve faster than traditional governance structures and responses. So going back to the question, this is not theoretical. It is profoundly it is profoundly practical. And the answer, at least from the institutional, the European side, is that the answer is yes. Trustworthy information still exists in 21st century, but only if we actively defend the conditions that make trustworthy information possible. And one has to acknowledge that trustworthy information does not emerge automatically. It depends on strong democratic institutions, on free and independent media, on free and fair elections, on transparent digital spaces, on informed citizens, and on resilient societies. It requires safeguards, cooperation, and continuous vigilance, and protection and promotion. And this is precisely the ambition behind the European Democracy Shield, which was adopted by the European Commission last year in November. It was adopted in the form of a joint communication with the High Representative for Foreign Affairs at the European Union. And why this is important to mention, it is because apart from what we call internal efforts and measures that are put forward by the Democracy Shield, this joint communication also has a very good synergy with the external actions of the EU, because the threats to democracy come from let's say, both geographical spaces, both within the EU and outside. The Democracy Shield focuses on several priorities. It has 3 pillars. The first one is safeguarding the integrity of the information space, which is, I believe, let's say, the mostly related to the topic today. The second one is strengthening democratic institutions, free and fair elections, and media freedom. And the third one is boosting societal resilience and citizens' engagement. Now, I have to state that the Democracy Shield reflects a simple understanding. Democracy cannot be protected, for instance, only at certain times of our existence. For instance, it cannot be protected only during the period of elections. It requires a constant effort. And secondly, it cannot be protected by governments alone. It has to be understood that the efforts should be common, like institutional and non-institutional, and the Democracy Shield is basically based on very simple principles when it comes to the approaches. It is the whole of society approach, the whole of government approach, and the whole of cycle approach. So another issue that it is very important to be mentioned is that with the Democracy Shield, we didn't start from zero. The Democracy Shield builds on a strong European framework, which is already in place, both legislative and non-legislative. On the legislative side, we have the very famous Digital Services Act, that actually increases accountability for online platforms. We have the Artificial Intelligence Regulation that introduces safeguards for high-risk AI systems. And we have the European Media Freedom Act that strengthens protection for independent journalism. And last but not least, it is also to be mentioned the rules on political advertising that increase transparency around the electoral campaigning. But regulation alone is not sufficient. The threats that we are facing, they are transnational, they are hybrid, they are constantly evolving. This is why coordination and preparedness are absolutely essential. And this is where the new European Center for Democratic Resilience, launched earlier this year, becomes particularly important. And I believe that my colleague Uldis will be a bit more extensive on this particular center. I'll just state a few words that it is a practical hub for cooperation. It is a network of networks connecting member states, EU institutions, experts, civil society, and practitioners. And basically, its role is to strengthen our collective capacity to anticipate, detect, and respond to threats to democracy. And in practice, this means improving situational awareness, supporting information sharing, and helping member states to develop operational responses to foreign information manipulation and disinformation. Very importantly, the center basically is built on the idea that democratic resilience is not built only from the top down, but also from down to top. And basically, civil society organizations, researchers, journalists, academics, local authorities, and citizens themselves play a vital role. And in the near future, hopefully, the center will be supported by a stakeholder platform bringing together these different independent, non-institutional actors. As I said, protecting trustworthy information does not mean controlling information. Europe's response is fundamentally different from authoritarian approaches because we do not defend democracy by restricting democratic freedoms, but we defend democracy by actually strengthening transparency, accountability, pluralism, and resilience. And this distinction matters enormously. And this goal is not to decide what citizens think, but is to ensure that citizens can make free and informed choices in an environment that is not artificially manipulated by hostile actors. And this challenge extends far beyond online platforms. For instance, we increasingly see threats against journalists, public officials, researchers, and political actors. We see intimidation, harassment, coordinated online abuse designed to silence participation and polarize debate. And in this case, I must say that unfortunately women and minority groups are disproportionately targeted when it comes to this kind of threats. This is why the Democracy Shield places a growing emphasis on safety in politics. Democracy cannot function if people are afraid to participate in public life. The Commission is therefore working with member states, experts, and civil society and political actors to develop practical tools, guidance, best practices on safety in political life. And this includes work on codes of conduct, awareness raising, support mechanisms, and capacity building initiatives to better protect those engaged in democratic processes. And at the same time, we also continue investing in citizens themselves because media literacy, critical thinking, and civic participation are not secondary issues. Basically, they are central pillars of democratic resilience. We do not have to concentrate only on the institutional side and on strengthening our authorities in responding to FINI and disinformations. Citizens who can critically assess information, recognize manipulation, and engage constructively in democratic debate are actually the strongest defense against disinformation. And cities, schools, universities, journalists, and community organizations are indispensable partners in this effort. And going back to the first question, is trustworthy information in the 21st century fantasy or reality? It is neither guaranteed nor impossible, but what we know is that it is a collective responsibility. And we have to admit that the information environment will never again resemble the simple media landscapes of the past. Complexity, speed, and technological disruptions are here to stay. But this does not mean that truth, trust, and democratic debate are doomed to disappear. Actually, Europe's answer is not pessimism, it is democratic resilience. By strengthening institutions, by protecting media freedom, increasing transparency, empowering citizens, and improving cooperation across all levels of society, we can ensure conditions for trustworthy information and democracy, and for the democracy to thrive. I'll close up by saying that the Democracy Shield is not about protecting or restricting people from debate, but protecting our democratic space from manipulation and intimidation. The Democracy Shield is not protecting institutions from criticism. On the contrary, is about providing the prerequisites for these criticisms to be expressed in a free and non-manipulated form. And ultimately, this is about creating trust, as I said. Trustful institutions, trustful mechanisms, trustful societies, and collective efforts basically would ensure the resilience of our democracies. You were referring in your question to what role for member states, for civil society, for candidate countries. Very shortly, I can say that these roles are covered by the whole of government and the whole of society approach that I have mentioned. Each and every of these sectors have a responsibility, and just a brief reference to the fact that candidate countries are involved in the measures put forward by the Democracy Shield, those that are relevant for them, because given this process of enlargement, which is actually feared by those that are putting forward hybrid attacks against the European Union. So these are targeting also the enlargement countries and our partners, being this vector of trying to destabilize the Union, the European Union. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing the debates, and I can already pass the baton to my colleague who will develop a bit more on the European Center for Democratic Resilience.
Thank you so much, especially for outlining the variety of topics that will be addressed by the Democracy Shield, the very important umbrella indeed, and especially I'm glad that you mentioned the different initiatives around also groups in society who are affected disproportionately a lot by disinformation. So thank you so much for outlining this for our discussion. All this is now your possibility to explain a little bit more about the center. It started its work a couple of months ago and has a long list of volunteer member states from across the Union. So perhaps you can speak a little bit more on what members see the center should focus on, how, and what the role of civil society and media will be in this. And if you could keep it to around 5-6 minutes, that would be excellent. Thanks so much.
I will do my best. Thank you so much, and thank you, OGP, for having me today. And luckily, my colleague already did a fair bit of intro to the center. Before I share a few slides, I think that the key takeaway, I think, really from the Shield and the center is this underpinning logic of whole of society approach, because it's guided by this understanding that, like that movie title, building resilience happens everywhere, all at once. And to do that, of course, we do need the kind of coordinating structures, or as my colleague put it, a network of networks to connect all these dots. That's basically the logic behind the center. Now, let me maybe share my screen a little bit so you don't have to keep looking at me. You can look at something far more entertaining. And I think this will be much more to your liking. I hope everybody can see. Right? We're good.
Yes, it works.
Excellent. You see a giant blue screen, European Center for Democratic Resilience. All right. Just very, very briefly, not to get into too many technical details, but indeed the center has been launched and is operational. We started this year. We started on the sort of technical preparation already in January, and then it was sort of formally kicked off and endorsed at the ministers' level and the General Affairs Council back in February. And since then, we've been working very diligently, and sort of the conceptually, the work, I would say, at this moment still follows two main work strands. One of them is maybe more interesting than the other one, but both are equally important. The first one, of course, is effectively still setting up the center. Just saying that it's launched doesn't hammer out all the practical details. So we're also actually have created a secretariat for the center, that involves the commission services, external action service, and all those that are identified in the European Democracy Shield joint communication as sort of, taking charge of this undertaking. So a lot of the work of the center currently is still focused on setting up the practical matters. So things like developing the workflows, setting the priorities for this year and then maybe the next year. Figuring out the way that we work and setting up, the IT infrastructure to use for coordination and for interaction, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the first steps was, of course, we want to make sure that we're off on the right footing here with the center. And I think the indication that all 27 EU member states are taking part in the center. It's a voluntary undertaking, of course, but I'm happy to say that everybody has expressed a very keen interest to be in part of this. And I think in part it is in recognition that this challenge of foreign information manipulation and interference, and this information is indeed a challenge for everybody. There's a rather recent Eurobarometer survey where more than 2/3 of EU citizens recognize that they face disinformation on a daily basis and that it is a challenge, of course, to them. So I think this is this sort of encapsulates that growing understanding that something needs to be done. And before I forget, I think you picked upon just earlier already in your introductory remarks, of course, also on this is not just about taking down the bad content, if I can put it this way, right? This is not just about limiting. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because what we've learned, a large part of information manipulation, foreign information manipulation, is also suppression of information. So, in response to that, the effort to ensure information integrity, of course, conversely, is providing access to trustworthy information. That's part of the logic behind the sort of comprehensive approach to democratic resilience that isn't just focused on responding to FIMI or disinformation. And I think that's sort of what also drives the center's work now, and more specifically on practical things. Which or maybe I'll get into a little bit on the specific projects. And here I think it's a very important aspect of how the center works, that it is based on a co-creation and a project-based approach, where whatever groupings of the involved participants can find projects that they deem useful, for their national or regional contexts, and there are, I think, issues that are of concern or in common for all 27 participants. There might be some that are more specific for some and others. I think this overall project-based approach enables the center, in a very operational sense, to really focus on providing support and outputs to where they're most needed, as deemed by the participants of the center. And I think this goes in line with our overall effort to ensure information integrity, or integrity of information space. We have to be very transparent about what we do. Of course, any efforts that are designed to counter foreign information manipulation and interference, usually the first line of criticism is along the lines of Ministry of Truth arguments, and this is, I think, why we have to be very transparent, why we are very transparent, both internally, the way that we communicate among the institutions, with the member states, with the governments in the member states, but also publicly with all of our citizens across the EU about what the center does. So one of the first things was to set up a public-facing interface to talk about what the center intends to do, what the center is already doing, and also create an internal coordination platform where all the actions are transparent to everybody who is in the center. This sort of community platform that brings all the participants together for the center. But I really would like to maybe focus on some of the things that how we work. I think it's a big mystery. Maybe what does it mean to connect the dots and to coordinate. And this is one of the first steps that we sort of figured out is how do we work, and it's by defining the common ideas that we want to work on, defining the scope of the problem, and outlining the next steps. And I think this aspect of constant consultation among the member states in various formats is very important, because that really is the whole of government, but also the whole of institutions, the whole of society approach. That coordination doesn't happen when we operate in silos, and it's part of the center's sort of overall mission, if you will, is trying to break those and try to bring in as many different voices as possible. Now, if we speak on the many different voices, I think some of the more concrete projects and deliverables for this year, and I'm keeping an eye on my watch too here, is in part, as I said, that first the technical work stream, setting up and figuring out the way that we work, and setting up all of that, but also starting to deliver on some of the more concrete projects. One of those, for instance, is another key deliverable under the European Democracy Shield, which is designing an EU blueprint for countering foreign information manipulation and interference and disinformation. Some of that work is sort of slowly being rolled out, of course, in very close consultation with all the member states. Again, this is a thing that needs to work for everybody. It works or it doesn't work for anybody. Another very practical avenue that the participants, the member states that in the center agreed, I think, very early on, that it makes sense that we share the concepts and the methodologies and the standards on how we work about detecting FIMI. And there is already a project pursued, led by a member state in the center to try to come to an agreement on what would be a sort of standard set of concepts and methodologies. I think very practically on the EU side, and I think my colleague could actually speak a little bit more on that, because they're in the lead of this project, is to develop a handbook that would bring together sort of the relevant EU legislation and tools and policy tools that are relevant for elections in member states, to help member states prepare as they seek to safeguard the information integrity of their information space ahead of elections. I think the top line priority that everybody agreed in the center is capacity building, is seeing what competencies, what expertise, what skills we have where, and how to bring those together. So there's a project on training the trainers that is currently developed by one of the member states that have sort of established capacity in sort of resilience building at a local community level, and rolling out the sort of training the trainers approach. That's one of the more immediate deliverables still for 2026. And I think maybe particularly interesting in this forum too, of the things that sort of sit in between these two streams of the technical and the practical projects, is establishing how does the center work, how does it associate with the candidate countries, with potential candidates, and create a stakeholder platform that would bring in civil society, that would bring in academia, that would bring in researchers. And I think that the next steps is for the participants of the center to agree on the modalities of how this would work, and some progress has been made there. And I would expect, in the rather near future, some more practical steps ahead are being taken. But it is driven by this overall logic, of course, that again, resilience building isn't something that can happen from a centralized building in Brussels or Strasbourg or wherever. Resilience building, by definition, as I started saying, isn't centralized. It is an effort that is very decentralized, that is very localized. As I like to say, resilience building starts in your kitchen. And that means that institutions have a role to play, but we're not the only ones, of course. National governments have a role to play, and civil society, or that sometimes characterizes sort of the frontline defenders, have a very crucial role to play. And of course, so does free and independent media, because, as I said, is one of the most devious ways of manipulating the information space is by information suppression. Then by that logic, of course, those providing trustworthy information, journalists and free and independent media, are the countermeasure, if you will, to that. And that's why the rollout of the stakeholder platform will be very important for dissent, and that's sort of I'd say a top line priority for 2026 to figure out the modalities on how we can facilitate this engagement between the various civil society actors across the EU and EU institutions and national governments of member states. I think I may have exceeded my time a little bit here, but I'm happy to stick around if there's an opportunity to engage further on with questions. I'm all yours to take those.
Excellent.
I'm stop
Perhaps
sharing.
Thanks so much. And maybe that's a good also an opportunity if you're sticking around. There is an audience question in the chat. Perhaps that's something that you could answer meanwhile. It's very specifically on the process of choosing actors participating in the center. Just because we're a little bit behind time, and let's move to our next part. But thank you so much, Mugur, and all this. This was an excellent way to really lay the groundwork and fundamentals for our discussion here, and great to see where the discussions are going, although it's all still being operationalized, right? And like you've shared about the center, there's definitely a lot happening and ways to be involved. But I'll hand over to Paul here for a little poll. That sounded Paul is doing a poll, but hopefully that was understandable. Here you go.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. Yes, indeed, Paul is doing a poll. So we'd like to just briefly hear a little bit from all of you, so that we can get a little bit of a sense of your experience of misinformation and disinformation. So a couple of questions. First one is, over the past week, did you encounter wrong, misleading, or manipulated information? So your choices are no, yes at least once, yes every day, or I can't remember. So you should have the poll should have popped up on your Zoom screen, hopefully. I see we've got 13 responding so far. Just give it another minute. 21 out of 29. Any final responses? So looks like 54% of you have experienced disinformation or wrong, misleading, or manipulated information, I should say, at least once. And an equal number of the remainder have either experienced it more than that or not at all. So I'm assuming you can all see the results the same way I can. If that's not the case, then let me know. So then we have a second question. One more question for you for this section. So where do you encounter this disinformation the most? Now we're forcing you to pick one here because we know that the answer could be many, but we're forcing you to pick one. So where do you encounter disinformation the most? I don't expect any major surprise with the result of this, but let's give people a moment to respond. We've got 24 people have responded. Maybe just one or two more. Could be OGP people, of course, choosing not to take part. So unsurprisingly, 79% of you experience disinformation the most on social media. And then the second category, far behind on 17%, was from other people like friends or colleagues. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to Karina now, and we'll have one more question for you later on.
Indeed, perhaps not a surprising responses here, but also rather disturbing how many times we will experience disinformation just in the last week or so. But we now turn to talking about trends and next steps with Katariina Zügel, who is the policy director at Forum on Information and Democracy. To dive right in, FID works with civil society and governments across the globe. Now, from your perspective, having heard these interventions from the European Commission, to kick us off, do you think disinformation takes a different form and shape in Europe than it does elsewhere?
Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much to the OGP for the invitation and organizing this important event and really bringing together the OGP, Open Government community, and the information integrity community. Then going to your question, I think the short answer is yes and no. It is actually the same structures that enable disinformation to flow everywhere, while it can take different forms, and notably in terms of actors involved, topics addressed, or tactics used. Maybe first of all, a point regarding the structures. We do live nowadays in an attention-driven economy where user data is collected to be monetized. This then means that the more attention a post can drive, the more visibility it gets. That means that disinformation and shocking content is an advantage vis-a-vis reliable, pluralistic content. Disinformation is also financially attractive. The digital advertising industry represents $1 trillion worldwide yearly, of which an estimated 110 billion are lost in fraud, financing, among others, disinformation. So this is a structure that is an issue in Europe, but also elsewhere. In addition to that, public interest media, those that actually do provide access to reliable information, are in a critical situation in terms of economic viability, but also their visibility, thereby reducing actually the availability of reliable information. So these structural challenges are the same or very similar everywhere. The institutional responses and the mechanism in place to act against these harms might different. And in Europe, we have the DSA, but also the EMFA that are important tools to address these structural challenges, even though implementation needs to go much further. However, there's also differences. Disinformation can take different forms and has varying degrees of impact on society. That depends very much on the trust in institutions, the trust in media, but also the viability and independence of media, and to which extent they remain key sources of information. So we've clearly seen when social media or, for example, private messaging platforms become key sources and main sources of information, disinformation can spread even further than when public interest media or public service media remain the number one sources for people. Also, the way disinformation acts might be very different. In Europe, we have a huge issue with FIMI. Some other regions, we work a lot with Latin America, are less confronted with FIMI and are rather victims of domestic disinformation actors, which also exists in Europe. But there's really clearly different key challenges in different regions, whereas the overall structures that enable disinformation to flourish are really the same everywhere.
Thanks so much. You really outlined a few differences here and already tapped into some of the challenges we're facing, right? So I recently went through a report from your organization that is titled Safeguarding Media Freedom in the Age of Big Tech Platforms and AI. And it did call for really a more ambitious structural reform, right? So it said we should move beyond merely mitigating media dependency, but really towards building an independent, pluralistic online information and media landscape that can sustain democratic debate and societal resilience. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that, especially given we're here with OGP. What are some of these open government compatible real life examples of structural reforms that respond to this result?
Thank you very much. Just to let everyone know, this is a report that we did in cooperation with the OSCE representative for the freedom of media, and that gives a really comprehensive overview of all kinds of more intermediate and long-term reforms that we need. And one of the key arguments we do is that we are currently in a situation where technologies are evolving very fast, with the latest threats to information integrity arising from AI systems. And so even though discussions to reform, for example, copyright to ensure that journalistic content is actually compensated are important and necessary, they also reinforce existing dependency and strengthen even further the market power of big tech. So what we really argue in this report is that if we want to truly enable access to reliable information and pluralistic online spaces, we need to make sure that these spaces and technologies are built based on values of democratic governance and open government, so that we stop running after regulating technologies that are often faster than us and trying to mitigate the harms, but actually build something that from the onset is built in the public interest. So we need infrastructure built in the public interest. And I think we have this quite a bit in other sectors. And states can play a very important role in this area by fostering such infrastructure. So investment, but also public procurement policies, both are valuable and powerful tools to direct the trajectory of technology. And these technologies that we need to be focused on innovative approaches, anti-monopolistic infrastructures, open source values, and interoperability. Unfortunately, we don't see very real life examples of these kind of technologies that have a very important place in society. There are some efforts vis-a-vis the creation of AI technologies. And I think there are some interesting examples also from the public service media sphere, where, for example, in the framework of the European Broadcasting Union, public service actors are working together to build an AI system that can actually produce reliable answers, and that is built on their own data and on their own resources. So there is a possibility for actors to work together. They pool their data, to pool their innovation, to pool their capacities and resources to build alternative structures. And one other big issue, and I think this is where the open government community can come in, is when we build these infrastructures that are more community-led, society-led, is the question of the governance and how to make sure that they cannot be captured. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from the public service media, but there's also where we need this collaborative approach and community-based approach that is promoted in open government. And I think we are in a situation where we need to work in two things in parallel. On the one hand, reduce the harms of current systems, and on the other hand, actually build systems that work in favor of democracy. And I think the European Democracy Shield and Center for Resilience are steps in that way.
You've already touched a little bit upon as well how many different intersections there are where disinformation needs to be tackled. Right, so it's often, as a reformer or a policymaker, it might be really difficult to know where to begin or where to focus your efforts. You've alluded to those as well, but Forum on Information and Democracy has also recently published reports on the role of advertisers in countering disinformation, as well as on information integrity on private messaging platforms, and as well as in environmental policy. So I wonder if you could say a few words about where you see in your work, where do you see the conversation is going? What are the trends that we really should be paying attention to most now?
So I think we're clearly moving away from just looking at social media regulation and social media as one of the key places where disinformation occurs and where that has an impact on society and polarization. But we are having more and more awareness about different places where disinformation occurs and the different forms it takes. So, for example, we did quite some work on private messaging platforms and how these very trusted spaces that were originally created for private communication are becoming more and more spaces of disinformation that are being abused and use this trusted space to influence. There's also more awareness of how disinformation campaigns are actually used for political gains. And For example, this is very much an issue in the area of climate disinformation that is used also to discredit government policies in general. So it's really not just used about harming climate policies, but also to discredit government and their legitimacy in general. And even though there's more and more awareness growing about the different forms that disinformation can take and the places it happens, in most of these areas, we still lack in-depth understanding and research about the tactics and actors, but also comprehensive approaches how to tackle the issue. One of our recent studies, for example, shows that even though the DSA covers private messaging platforms to a certain extent, and with the latest designation of WhatsApp, there's still actually quite some uncertainty among digital service coordinators and different actors of how it applies and how we can use it to effectively tackle disinformation and also tackle it on other platforms such as Telegram. Similarly, our ongoing study on climate change, information integrity on climate change, shows that while there's a raising knowledge, and I think that's also visible in the declaration that came out of the COP30, there's still very scattered policy responses. So we see that the conversations are moving beyond the original focus on social media and its harms, looking at more different specific sectors, different impact of different technologies, but we're still very much in the beginning of really knowing how to tackle these different issues. But we also believe that we actually need to move really beyond tackling just disinformation and reducing the harms. And I think was alluded and also in the democracy shield, we really need to focus also on ensuring actually access to reliable information, for which we need public interest media and ensure their viability and visibility. And therefore, we promote ideas that go beyond what we currently have. One of them is notably due prominence of journalistic content in different algorithms, chatbots, to really make sure this kind of content is visible and easily findable. This requires, on the one hand, legal obligations for platforms, but it also needs financial support and structural reforms to ensure that public interest media can thrive, which is, as you've seen in the latest RSS index, in the worst situation it has ever been. We also published last year a call by 11 leading economists, including 3 Nobel Prize winners, which really highlighted that actual reliable information media freedom is not just an issue of democracy and open government, as we're discussing today, but it's also the backbone of our information economy. So I think there's really also a need to enlarge the debate and show that we're not just talking about saving democracy, but our whole economic and social development is built on the necessity to have access to reliable information. And so I think this is really also where open government can come in to enlarge the debate, to bring in other reforms that are necessary, such as access to information, strengthening trust in democratic institutions, and overcoming the polarizations that we're currently facing.
Thank you for really highlighting the types of reforms that this community can advance. And as you've now seen, we've started from really spotlighting the European Commission's approach to this, but Katarina has also shown a little bit of a wider research-based approaches from a comparative side on what works and what doesn't, and where we see going forward. So thank you so much. Before we go to our last section during this webinar, I hand back to Paul for a little bit of one more question to you, the audience.
Thanks, Karina. Yeah, so just one more question for all of you. So what has helped you most in spotting dis or misinformation? We're going to ask you to choose one choice as well. So on the Zoom poll, you'll see notices of flagged content online. Option 2, I proactively fact check if I meet new information. 3, I rely on sources and media I know and trust. 4, discussing with friends and colleagues. Or finally, information has been obviously manipulated or AI generated. Oh, sorry, there was also something else. So we've got, we're asking you to choose one of these only. So it's about 15 people have chosen so far. Looks like at the moment. Fact checking is the most popular choice for about 50% of people, slightly over 50%. Next would be I rely on sources and media I know and trust. And thirdly, on 17% would be information has been obviously manipulated or AI generated. Yes, and over time, perhaps that will become harder and harder as well. It's one of the concerns. So thanks for that. Just a very quick poll, and back to Karina for our final section.
Thank you very much. All right, and I see there was also a question or more about even a comment really from the audience in the chat. Meanwhile, and I'll just read it to you as well. Could we say that access to information is no longer only a matter of transparency, but also increasingly a matter of democratic capability, meaning the actual ability to identify, interpret, and use trustworthy information? That is a great question to start off with. Going to our third section here, where we really dig deeper into the real practical side of countering disinformation through three different cases, also very different from each other. First off, we turn to Anna Petrusheva, who is the director of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, Macedonia. Anna, I see that you're going to start us off with a case study of documenting the assets of some specific religious organizations whose properties have for years been a matter of speculation as well as of disinformation. Looking forward, can you tell us a little bit more of that?
Yes, but if I can just first comment on the question, if I may.
Of course.
I love the fact that it says, meaning the actual social ability to identify, interpret, and use trustworthy information, because that shows a society, yes, which is in need for trustworthy information. And I come from a society that can do that, but very often has on the other side a government that might not be that, let's say, interested in providing that information. So from our perspective, I would say, or point of view from North Macedonia, I would say it is also very much a matter of the question how do we sit with the political will to divulge information. I think that's also a very important aspect. So I wanted to talk about something different today. Our speciality of my organization in North Macedonia is that we mainly do this massive databases that are always basically motivated by the lack of information, but also a lot of disinformation, whether how much the revamp of Skopje, the neoclassical revamp costs, or how much foreign direct investments have there been over a period of 10 years, and matters like that where it has been seen by different governments that it would be useful to perhaps manipulate or, let's say, politically it would have suited them for various, whether it is before or ahead of elections, to use information to advance their political points. One such matter, and this time we decided to get into a topic that is rarely covered and is usually shied away from, because I would think that, two topics are kind of regularly clouded in secrecy. If we say the military and the church. And in this case, we decided to see what is happening with the church, or in our case, the two dominant religious communities, which is the church and the Islamic religious community. So they have been, their wealth and their assets and their businesses have been a matter of speculation for many, many years. And at the same time, we have been witnessing an expansion of their business interests, which has which at the same time means that not only they have huge societal influence, but they also have quite a lot of political influence, because they have big business interests in construction business, in energy business, and so on. So we decided that we wanted to see and to map what they have. And after a year and a half, not to say two, we've managed to identify and categorize and analyze and put together in a relatively simple manner in a database, which I will send. It works well with Google Translate, and I will send it in the chat. So you can take a look. It's basically two separate databases, one of the Syrian Orthodox Church, the other one of the Islamic religious community, where we have identified these separate 20,000 pieces of property, whether it is meadows or rivers or mountains, forests, buildings, business spaces, hotels, and etc. But and we have sort of, based on what we've discovered and documented, we have done various investigative stories, and basically discovered that regardless of the huge businesses that they have and business activities with these properties, like for instance, loads of them are being rented out. All of that is sort of under the radar. It is not being taxed. It is not being reported. They do not declare their finances. So we have published all of that and put under the spotlight both the institutions and the church and the Islamic community, which then led to a public debate, discussions. Why is that so? Could that be changed? And so on. And to get to the point about transparency, none of this would have happened if we didn't have access to the cadastre, to the land registry, which cannot be searched. We found a way how to do that and how to identify, but if it was not open source, we would have never been able to do so. The same way that we wouldn't have able to do numerous other stories that we've done that have looked into, spending of different government institutions, which we can now monitor as one of the biggest sort of successes through OGP has been to open the treasury and to be able to follow all financial transactions of the government. And so in this process, we managed to discover quite a lot about not only about what the religious community's own, which is now available in these public databases and is used, I would assume, by all sorts of various, other than journalists, various other researchers, academics, anti-corruption experts, and so on. And is there to stay and is there to be double checked, and who knows, maybe at some point updated. But it has also triggered quite a debate on the position of these communities and whether the state should allow things to proceed as they are, where they have very little financial responsibility and are kind of in this privileged, guarded position. Have I spoken too long?
You're okay. Thank you so much, Anna. I think you've really outlined with this. Well, you started off with also saying like sometimes it's not also the environment that you need to operate in. Isn't the guarantee that the government is the one who provides the trustworthy information, right? And then you also highlighted the different ways of what the infrastructure of in this case of information and transparency needs to be there to ensure that in media, but also investigative media, journalists can do their job in a proper way to hold power to account, whether the power is with the state or with other powerful groups. So that's really a great example.
Katarina, I think, mentioned as well the importance of reliable information and access to information. And I think that, for instance, for the countries in the Balkans, that is extremely important. And it's also important that it can never be, it cannot be taken for granted. If you look like 10 years back, for instance, Serbia was among the top countries in terms of FOIA requests, freedom of information requests. Now it has significant issues when it comes to that. Just as an illustration here, for instance, we also thought that, once you achieve certain victories and conquer certain mountains, there's no coming back. But we were wrong, because, for instance, there was a period when there was a lot of problems with transparency and closed institutions for information. Then there was, gradually success. But now we're seeing, again, reversal to the old practices. Just as an illustration, for instance, the Agency for for Access to Freedom of Information, where journalists and citizens and organizations file complaints when they do not get their response from institutions, in 2024 had received 350 complaints, and in 2025 it received 626, which is nearly double. Which means that, the trend is that the institutions are more closed.
Absolutely, have to always don't take victories for granted in that sense. But now we turn to a very different example, or maybe not, we'll find out. But Ihor Samokotsky is a founder of Policy Genome. So here you are to tell us about the findings of cross-lingual audits of AI systems on high-risk topics and how language can affect results even within the same AI model. We've touched upon AI quite a bit from edges today, but what have your audits shown you?
First, hi everyone, thanks for having me. I believe I will be speaking about blind spot. And from the poll we have before, we see that there was no option that I get misinformation from AI. So basically, even today, we couldn't have this option, only elsewhere, but we won't say that it's AI. And we know that at least hallucinations are widespread phenomenon that almost everyone knows. And this is, I believe, that the majority of people using AI daily could face. So basically, first I want to tell why I care so much about LLMs misinformation. Because millions of people, and right now actually about 1 billion of people monthly use LLMs to get information. So right now people will get information not only from social media, institutions, and the sources we get used to, but actually from the LLMs. And LLMs are very different from all the other sources of information. I describe it as a black box in a dark room. So first, the technology of LLM is a black box. So feel free to Google it if you weren't interested in that, but this is from technology perspective very different from all the other media and social media. So this is a black box. And why it is in a dark room? Because it happens in the private chat. So if we, for instance, want to analyze the social media, the wherever classical source of information, at least usually you have some link, you can share it, etc. And you can see what I see. And in LLMs, it's different because it's my private chat and I get information from it and you do not know what's there. So we have this completely new informational environment with different technology, with different principles. and that actually impacts what people think more than any classical media. Basically, there are researchers showing that dynamic text from LLMs is more persuasive on elections than static media text, for instance. So we already know this. This is not a secret. And that's why I'm, as Ukrainian, we are attacked with the Russian disinformation. I believe like we are one of the most attacked nations in the world in terms of foreign misinformation. And for me, it was interesting to, given my professional background and work with LLMs and public tech policy, I created the method and the research of how leading world large language models answer questions about Russian misinformation narratives. So we audited 6 leading LLMs, and we have some insights that I want to share with you today, and the proposals based on this. Everything that I will speak about is published, the method, the data, the policy brief, etc. Everything is available. So let's first stop on impact and what we saw. So first, disinformation in LLM is language dependent. So basically, the language you use to ask questions in AI impacts what answers you get. So in Yandex, we see completely, Yandex is one of the leading tech companies in Russian world, and not only in Russia. This is a tech giant, basically like Google, but for the other part of the world. And Yandex models behave completely differently depending on the language you ask questions. So for instance, if you ask about Russian disinformation narratives in English, you will have refusals from the AI. So it won't even answer your question. But if you ask it in Russian language, you get the Kremlin narrative. So this is first. Second, what we saw, and it is available on Euronews and YouTube. So how the AI writes the correct answer about Bucha massacre, and then it hides it. So basically there is filter that filters the truth about the narratives that Russia wants to hide, basically. This is the next one. And the last one, that Western models, basically ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, they have this issue of false balance. So basically when we have some factually known information, they say, okay, there are both sides, we have to find some neutral answer here. So this is an issue for AI, because when AI has neutral position on some political issue, this is one behavior. But when it is neutral against some fact that is known and established, this is completely different behavior. Neutrality on facts isn't actually neutrality, it's false balance. So we documented this, measured, and the method is there to replicate it in any other field. So basically, people will ask and already ask AI about healthcare, about democracy, about nuclear threats, about whatever, about their jobs. And we created a method how to document the output of the LLM and how to find disinformation. And so what are basically the implications and why open government approach actually is so crucial here in this regard? Because we know that governments want to create their own LLMs, like national sovereign LLMs. Governments apply available LLMs in their internal systems. And basically governments want to regulate somehow LLMs. So there are multiple layers of how LLMs are becoming part of governance. But there is no layer of how we actually track what is the output created by the LLM. So imagine your government is creating national LLM, and it doesn't even know what the output of the model will be depending on the language. So basically, when you procure or create your LLM, you need to create some benchmarks so that you know that it is reliable for your context. And therefore, like this, and this should be transparent, because usually in private sector of AI development, all these red teaming exercises, they're closed. You do not know how the safety works in LLMs. And this should be really open. How we measure, how the governments measure, how the civil society measures the reliability of the information that LLM produces. either for government, either for citizens. And only then we can really decide which action we might take in terms of regulation of some AI system. So basically, all the procurements of LLMs should contain this stress testing, which is public, which is against clear methods that we could trust. And cross-language misinformation audits should be a part of this standard method. So usually all the methods and evals are against English language. But if you are not in English-speaking country, or for instance, you are in Baltic countries where there are many Russian-speaking population, you can't afford yourself to rely only on a single language audit. So basically, a cross-language issue is very crucial. And basically, that's it. And we are looking for research and institutional partners to scale this to other topics, other regions and languages. And I'll drop links in chat, so feel free to read this. Everything is available and free.
Excellent, thank you. Really spotlighting a black box in a dark room, like you said. It's a powerful allegory right there. But last but not least of these, as I warned you, very different case studies, we have Camille Lacliffe, who is the manager of Behavior Sciences Project at the Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation in France. That's a mouthful. But Camille, you have actually recently worked with Viginum, which is the French authority focused on foreign interference and information manipulation, to provide behavioral insights for countering disinformation. So can you tell a little bit about this side of research and what we could take with us from the research that you put together?
Sure. Thank you for this introduction. So indeed, I'm a PhD in cognitive science. I've worked in research before. And I also have been involved for about 10 years now in several topics promoting critical thinking and public sensitization to disinformation. And we're speaking today about a project that we conducted in the BI unit of my Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation. Well, in this team, just a few words, we support ministries and administrations in solving the challenges that they're facing by using knowledge and methods from behavioral science to design user-centered and evidence-based public policies. And in this context, Viginum contacted us about 1 year ago to focus on one question: what strategies are efficient when it comes to fighting conspiracy theory or a piece of fake news or disinformation that was produced or spread by a foreign country and meant to interfere with democracy. And so to answer their request, my colleagues Camille Soulet, Mariam Chamat, and we performed an academic literature review in cognitive and social sciences. And we also conducted a benchmark of international practices in fighting against disinformation. And we also conducted interviews with experts, mostly researchers, but not only, who work on understanding the mechanisms and underpinnings of disinformation and beliefs in false information. So to be honest, when we started to check on the academic literature, we did not find many things on specifically foreign digital interferences. So we broadly focused on disinformation. And there are many things about fake news and disinformation in the cognitive science literature. So I'll tell you a few lessons that arise from our investigations. First, lessons about the mechanisms of beliefs in disinformation. So first, the first lesson that we came up with is that people, studies show that people are not that gullible and have a significant ability to distinguish between accurate and inaccurate information. There is rather a skepticism bias, as people tend to be better at identifying incorrect information rather than correct information. The second lesson is that people believe false information for many reasons, Sometimes it may be because they're convincing, but also sometimes it's just through social norms, to belong to a community, and so on. So there are many reasons that might explain why people could believe in false information. And third, well, it's not easy to study mechanisms behind beliefs in disinformation. And for two main reasons. The first one is that it's difficult to assess the intentions behind the spread of false information. We cannot know, like in reality, in real life, why we cannot know for sure, at least in the research context, why some piece of information was created or started to spread. So we can only design false information and assess scientifically their impact, to which extent people believe and spread this information. And the second reason why it's not that easy to study those kind of things is that sharing a piece of information does not mean agreeing with it. And on social media, many people, that's the only proxy that we can access, people sharing information. But people can also share information not because they believe it, but because for fun, for satirical reasons, for social motivations, and so on. And this is hard to disentangle while performing some studies. Then we focused on the different strategies that exist to reduce beliefs in disinformation. First, the main strategies are interventions based on media literacy and fact-checking, and both prove to have a positive impact, significant impact. However, this impact varies with many different factors, and that's what many studies show. It can vary with the intervention temporality, so how long it will last and how often or how frequently you will address some information to the participants of the study. It may vary depending on the provision of a credible alternative narrative. So, for example, when you're doing fact-checking, it's not enough to say this information is wrong to correct the beliefs, but you have also to provide a credible alternative narrative. And it works better if it's sufficiently detailed. There is also the trust in the source of information that will impact the influence of intervention. The topic as well, it's not the same when we speak about disinformation in health or in politics. It will depend also on people's ideology. Well, many different factors can impact the efficiency of those strategies. And these strategies, they all are individual approaches. And these individual approaches, they carry risk. First, the first risk is raising skepticism bias. We don't want to end up with people just believing that everything is wrong and incorrect and not believing any information anymore, especially not believing in correct information. That would be dramatic. So this is a side effect that we have to keep in mind. There is also the difficulty to reach the people who are actually exposed and affected to disinformation. This is not that easy when we design an intervention to counter disinformation, especially in real-world situation, but also in research. And there is also the risk of impacting beliefs, but not behaviors. So fact-checking may influence, for example, the ability to distinguish between true and false information, but it does not always lead to a change in behavior, for example, a change of voting behavior or whatever. And most of these classic interventions that focus on the individual level, they're based on an assumption. This assumption is that the exposition of people who are gullible to false information directly influence the beliefs and induce behavioral change. However, this model does not reflect reality and does not reflect what many different studies in psychology, for example, experimental psychology, show. And what we advocate for is that we must move beyond this simplistic view, and as these individual factors are not the only ones that explain why people believe disinformation. There are other factors, such as environmental factors, that contribute to the spread of disinformation. And that's also an important lesson, the last main lesson of the review we conducted. Material, economical insecurity, as well as growing social inequality may have an impact and rise the risk of the spread of disinformation. Institutional and scientific distrust as well. There are more beliefs in conspiracy theories and disinformation, whether it's political or medical, when individuals have little trust in science or in their politicians. And polarization and intergroups hostility also has an impact. So disinformation thrives in the context of social divisions, with factors such as loneliness, the breakdown of local solidarity, emotional polarization, and all such factors intensify the search for narrative of belonging and meaning. And so in certain contexts, influenced by those environmental factors, it can actually make sense to believe some false information. And that's what we have to keep in mind while designing interventions to fight false information. And so what can we do with these lessons? Well, they pave the way to new ways of addressing the spread of misleading narratives by tackling the root causes of their acceptance. So belief in disinformation should not be seen as the origin of systemic dysfunctions, but rather as a symptom of social, economical, institutional imbalances. And so as this disinformation's impact grows from society's pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as anxiety, division, inequalities, we need to focus on those factors. So, for example, by strengthening social, economical, and public health policies, revitalizing community spaces, fighting isolation, and strengthening social cohesion, building trust by fighting corruption and demonstrating transparency, and fighting media concentration and ensuring stable fundings to safeguard the independence of the media. And so on the long run, and along some interventions that focus on the individual level, such systemic intervention would allow to reduce distrust of institutions, of the media, vulnerability to disinformation, polarization of the debate, and so on. So the welfare state may actually be the strongest defense. And at the same time, we must also advocate for the quality of information. As I mentioned, there is this risk of skepticism bias. So we need to help people, to enable people to identify the true, the correct information. And this strategy may be even more efficient than fighting against misinformation. So these were the main lessons of the literature review we conducted, and we published, well, it's in French, sorry, but now it's easy to translate. We published a detailed report of this academic literature review, and it was used as one of the bases to build the national strategies to fight against misinformation and information manipulation in France.
Thank you so much, and feel free to also share the even if it's in French, as you say, it's easy to translate in the chat, and we'll share this as well afterwards with everyone who's registered. But I hope this small case study example panel really showed you the richness of what it means to really counter disinformation. Anything from creating transparency infrastructure when it comes to data and accessibility, media freedom, behavioral aspects of how we really need a whole of society approach. How do we make a difference between mistrust and distrust towards information, as well as blind spots in technology, especially in new LLMs. But to close us off, I now turn to Paul.
Thanks. I'll be very brief as I know we're pretty much out of time, but just a big thanks to all of the speakers. A bit like the topic itself, that was a huge amount of information. So if like me, you're trying to process it all still, don't worry, we've recorded this topic, but we've done a whistle-stop tour of mis and disinformation in terms of the issues behind that itself, some of the possible solutions. But coming back to the original question, in terms of the rhetorical question we posed about whether trustworthy information in the 21st century is a fantasy or a reality, I hope you have not concluded that it's a fantasy and that you have instead concluded that at least it can be a reality, even if our current situation is a mixed picture. If the amount of information in our information ecosystems can be overwhelming, as well as the information systems themselves and how quickly they evolve. So it can be very hard for all of us working in open government, especially us generalists, to keep up, even policymakers in the field to keep up. So that's the importance of the open government community, I think, and hopefully forums like this where we can bring people together from different perspectives, some working at the very local level, some working at regional level, civil society, government, media, sharing solutions, sharing tactics, pooling resources, working across borders, as well as taking action at national level, which is, of course, one of the key mechanisms of OGP. So I hope that this can provide some food for thought. And I hope that at least some people are coming away with fresh ideas about how to address mis and disinformation in their own context. If so, please, if you see a reform opportunity in your country or at regional level, please do reach out to the OGP team. We'd love to hear about it and help support you in whatever way we can. But thanks again to all the excellent contributors. And just to close by saying that we have another webinar coming up in this series. If you like this whistle-stop tour of mis and disinformation, we're going to be covering a very connected topic next month, which is civic space. So that will be on June the 4th. The details are on the slide, and you'll find them on the OGP website as well. Registration is open. So please do come along to that as well. Thanks to everybody and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.